Thank you, Annie. All right, good morning, folks. Bonjour. My name is Matt White. In Paris, you can refer to me as Mathieu Leblanc. I will respond to both. So thanks for joining me this morning. I wanted to go for a little bit more a high-level talk here on what we're doing in industry and at the Linux Foundation, and the importance of open source and open standards. So we kind of kicked off this year with a lot of headlines like the following here from CNBC and Morningstar around, obviously, the DeepSeek moment and how R1 was released in open source, and a lot of the sort of innovations they had done for like this maybe 9 months prior that kind of culminated and kind of shook the markets a little bit, right? And so sort of as a knee-jerk reaction, Sam Altman has come forward and said basically maybe they aren't on the right side of things with respect to open source, and that they need to rethink their strategy. And it's probably not a mystery, but now it's pretty well known that they're currently developing their own open model. And so last year, Mark Zuckerberg had said that basically open source AI is the only path forward, right? This is something they've realized. They've started, they're responsible for building a lot of the tools in this space, but also the open models, or the accessible models with the Llama family. And then also Kai-Fu Lee has also stated publicly that he believes that open source AI will prevail ultimately. And this is a powerful statement, right? The whole thing here is that open source AI is really starting to come into the public conscious. So open source software itself, there was a Harvard Business School study, and it basically estimated that the supply side value of open source is around 4.5 billion. And then on the demand side, a much higher value at $8.8 trillion, right? So this is a huge number. This means that a lot of the companies that are employing open source today see the value, or basically to reproduce the innovations in open source would cost any company around 3.5 times what they currently spend on open source development. Now, this study was limited to open source. It did not encompass open source AI. And as you can imagine, the magnitudes of costs here would be substantially higher because of the model training costs and others that go into producing open models. And so I don't even know what that number would be, but it would be significantly higher than this. So it's becoming apparent that open source is, in fact, eating the world, right? Another recent study from Harvard and the Linux Foundation found that basically 70 to 90% of any code base is made up of open source software. And that leaves about 10 to 30% for custom code. And we're generally seeing this sort of same numbers play out in the open source AI space as well. But again, open source AI is a fairly relatively new paradigm, right? And certainly for future studies might reveal similar numbers. So what's becoming apparent is that open source AI is having a moment. But why does this matter, right? Why does this matter for AI? Why does it matter for open source? Why does it matter now? And really right now is an opportune time because the global AI race is picking up. So countries are really looking and evaluating their AI positions. Some countries are really striving for dominance in the AI space. And proprietary systems have kind of created these silos. They've gated and obfuscated what happens behind the scenes, where open models really offer a highly usable, highly accessible alternative to these closed systems. There's also a demand for transparency and trust, right? This is where regulators who are really taking strong, looking at evaluating AI and a position of open source, enterprises, end users are looking for transparency. They're looking for accessibility. They're looking for auditability and systems that they can really employ, right, safely. So, and openness is really that answer to that question, right? Is how can you gain access to a model? How can you red team a model without being encumbered by classifiers and other guardrails that are in front of that, which aren't exposing the model's true behavior to the end user? And this really creates trust, right, when you have access to the model in an unfiltered manner. And so a lot of innovation is also happening in the open, right? Open science, science in the open source, a lot of open terms, but a lot of the more recent breakthroughs have been, and even prior breakthroughs have been replicated in open source, right? And so we look at like agentic workflows. A lot of the agentic frameworks are in open source. The more LLMs are being released with open licenses, and a lot of these new techniques are really coming to the forefront. And for those that have been in AI research for a long time, open science was always sort of the paradigm, but as these two worlds of open source and AI come together, it's important that we prevail with an open approach. And then there's ecosystems like PyTorch's ecosystem and the communities that are built around Hugging Face that are extremely important, that help push the dial forward on openness. And then finally, policy and compliance. So the EU AI Act, the executive orders by this administration and the prior administration in the US are all creating this legal shift towards openness in AI, right? They're seeing value in openness. And ultimately, organizations and enterprises and end users are going to need frameworks, they're going to need licenses, they're going to need standards that help advance open AI. So a quick look at where we've had success in open source AI, right? So PyTorch has been around for, it'll be 10 years next year. It is a widely adopted framework, right? It's become the de facto framework for training large models. If you pick any large model out there that you enjoy using, it is probably trained with PyTorch. And really, there are a lot of mission critical systems, used by Tesla and others in governments that rely on PyTorch as an open framework. And it's built trust through openness. The project itself has seen great success with over 89,000 stars on GitHub. And I encourage you to put another star there. 3,800 contributors now, more than 3,800 contributors, and every continent in the world is represented by contributions in PyTorch. Also, there's some lessons learned, right, from our experiences, and we've seen PyTorch thrive in a strong vendor-neutral environment where no one company controls the outcome of the project. Also, we've integrated with other platforms, with their standards, and this has become sort of a way of working in the open, right? So what's happening at the Linux Foundation? So at the Linux Foundation, we have a lot of foundational technologies that have sort of ushered in this new era of AI, right, of open source AI. The obvious ones being like PyTorch and Onyx, but non-obvious things further down the stack, like the Linux kernel and Kubernetes, which power a lot of these clusters. And then newer projects, right, like VLLM, DeepSpeed, and then agentic frameworks like BAI and others. And so we continue to grow this family of projects for the community. But that's not the only thing that we do, right? We're building community as well. So the Generative AI Commons being one of the sort of bastions of this community growth. So the Model Openness Framework was released about a year ago. More recently, the Responsible Generative AI Framework was released, and I would ask you to read that paper. It's a good read. The Model Openness Tool, that is at open.ai, that's tracking model openness. And then newer initiatives like the Open Model Initiative, as well as the World Dataset, are starting to gain some traction. And if you want to join the Generative AI Commons, it is an open community and it is open to everyone. So it's a bit of a busy slide, but I did want to show this to give you an idea of where we are thinking about the world of open source AI. And we've distilled sort of the entire ecosystem down into 4 different domains. So we've got infrastructure at the bottom. This is fundamentally where we're interfacing with hardware, custom kernels, this sort of very low-level space that we're operating at. And then we've got the model domain as well, which is where we're having, this is where PyTorch lives, right? Like pre-training and fine-tuning and so forth. We also have data. So we have these data stores, we've got vector stores, we've got graph databases and other platforms within the ecosystem that are freely available. And then applications. So this is probably the newer space for us to enter into, where we're talking about agentic frameworks and AI application frameworks, as well as prompt level operations, so prompt caching, routing, and other factors. So we've talked about open source, right, and AI, and now I want to touch quickly on open standards in AI. So Anthropic released MCP back in November of last year. It quietly moved along until a couple of months ago, and then kind of picked up some real steam with a lot of MCP servers being released. A2A protocol was recently released by Google. And there's also the ACP protocol released by IBM, and there are some others emerging. And we're probably in a space right now where we're going to see a little bit of standards wars as folks look to try and solve different problems within the AI ecosystem, as we're moving further away from model centricity and moving towards AI system centricity. But not a lot of folks know this, but in fact, the Linux Foundation is the home to over 200 open standards. We have 2 vehicles that are powering a lot of these standards, which are the Joint Development Foundation and then the community specifications. The big difference between these 2 is that the Joint Development Foundation is more of a sort of a conventional, vendor-neutral sort of SDO type approach. And then community specifications is centered around more the open source experience, right? So projects that are managed out in the open, they've got reference implementations and code base that is tightly bound to the specification. But that leaves one piece of this puzzle that is not being solved yet, right? And this is an open license for AI. And so we've quietly been sharing that we've been working on this license. We've garnered community feedback, but OpenMDW is the first permissive open license made available to the public. And so I'm pretty happy to announce that this license covers model architectures, it covers data sets, it covers parameters, it covers documentation and any tools, right? So Apache 2.0, MIT, very much designed for software. It is explicitly written in the text that it covers software. Obviously, AI models are more complex, ML models are more complex, there's more components, and so we have to reevaluate how we look at licensing. Now, OpenMDW is a global license, so it is not, it can be mixed with other licenses. So if you want to license your data under a different license like CDLA or CC by 4.0 or something, perfectly acceptable. If you want to release software under Apache and still have it in the same distribution, totally acceptable. It is a global license, so it's a fallback license. It does include a lot of the things that are pertinent in AI, right? So copyright, patent, database, and trade secret laws are all very important, and we have to have text around that. It does include a patent litigation protection, so if somebody sues you, they lose all rights to the model. And something that's pretty important here is we don't apply restrictions on model outputs. So effectively, we aren't saying that the model outputs are copywritten or not copywritten. That is beyond the scope of this license. But the license itself is highly compatible with the open source definition. It is highly compatible with the EU AI Act exemption for open source AI. And so I think we're long overdue for a license like this. This process started over 9 months ago. And the beauty of this license is that it follows the conventional paradigms of a single license file that you drop into the root of your repo, and it effectively applies to everything in your repo, regardless of the modality, regardless of the component, and of course you can override that with a third-party license. So I'll leave you with some final notes. I would always suggest that you use open source licenses for your AI tools and libraries. We need a richer ecosystem. Everybody is out there innovating, and we can continue to build great projects that satisfy or solve problems within the AI ecosystem. Obviously, adopt permissive licenses for ML models. Maybe that's not that obvious, but I would like to say, like Apache 2.0, MIT, please rethink using those licenses for your models so that your models are properly licensed. We need to be champions of global collaboration, right? So we're living in a time of like AI nationalism where countries are sort of wanting to become more protectionist about their work in AI, their research, and what they release. But the only way that open source AI thrives will be by continuing to push out innovations into the open. And then, don't overregulate. So I don't know if there's anyone in regulation here, but clearly there are some areas of the world that are overregulating right now, and that really pushes down innovation, right? It really just won't create a very thriving environment for open source AI. And then don't overlook open standards, right? We need open standards. We need to come to vendor-neutral open standards so that not one single vendor is deciding what is inside of a specification, but that we can get to a place where we have open standards that are highly dependable, reliable, and have longevity. And then again, build responsibly, right? Trustworthy AI, responsible AI. It starts at from the engineering, from the training side of things, and all the way through to product development. So let's move from open source AI having a moment, and let's make this sort of the de facto standard that open source AI is the way to be. Thank you.